Corner on the slideshow.
Oh, there you go. Yeah. Back there again. Okay. Yeah, thank you. That's simple. Listen, me and this kind of technology, we are not good friends, I promise you. I get dragged kicking and screaming into the 21st century. All right, so we did the scripture reading, but I want us to just look at number 4, verse 47, where David says he's coming against Goliath. He says, "Then all this assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands." And of course, we know the rest of the story. You know, one stone, and David killed and knocked Goliath down and then sliced his head off. It's interesting, and I know you all know this, that when David picked up stones, he picked up five. And people say, well, why did he pick up five? Did he not maybe trust that he would be correct on the first stone? But we find in the Bible that Goliath had four brothers. So he probably picked up stones for not just Goliath, but his brothers as well. But David is a great example because um, he was just a small guy, right? He was a little shepherd out in the field. And when Samuel came to Jesse, David's father, and wanted, because God said one of Jesse's sons is going to be the next king, Jesse didn't even consider bringing David in. He paraded all of his other sons. And then Samuel said, "Do you have anyone else?" And finally, he brought David. And that kind of tells us something important, which I'm going to get to in a little while. But the title of the lesson is the gods. At the top there was the, the gods at war, and then the title, the subtitle, in the midst of the battle that belongs to the Lord. And we are actually in the midst of that battle. Um, I know where you guys live, a tornado, you don't even know what a tornado is, right? Back down Cape area, the only thing you know about it is that you've probably seen pictures of it or the movie. But where I live, I'm just on the outskirts of what's called Tornado Alley. And north of me, going up into Oklahoma, a lot of tornadoes, and we get warned pretty regularly. The reason I've brought a tornado into the picture here is that we need to recognize, I believe, that while we live on the physical planet Earth, there is a spiritual battle going on. And it's almost like there's a spiritual tornado that is around us all the time. It's like when you're at church, maybe, and you're all in the building, and it's almost, if you use your imagination, at the doorway to the church, there are the good angels and then the bad angels. And there's a warfare at the church where the good angels are keeping the bad guys out. And we know, Revelation 12 tells us that when Satan was kicked out of heaven, he took one third of the angels with him. And so I'm not charismatic. I'm not being charismatic, but I think it is important for us to recognize that there is a spiritual warfare going on. And sometimes it's not a bad idea to allow our imaginations to run a little while just to remind ourselves that there is far more to existence than just our physical lives. So we recognize that Ephesians chapter 6 tells us that we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. And of course, Ephesians 6, where this verse comes from, is taken from it's verse 12, but it's taken from Ephesians 6, where he talks about the Christian's armor. And the fact that we have armor means that we are in a battle. Now, what kind of a battle is it actually? And so 2 Corinthians 10, 3 through 6, the Apostle Paul says, "For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal or fleshly, but mighty in God for pulling down strongholds, casting down arguments and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ, and being ready to punish all disobedience when your obedience is fulfilled. And so there is a battle going on, no doubt, and God invites us into the battle. And so this morning, I just want to talk about, or for you this evening, 2 points. And one is simply that the battle belongs to the Lord. And we heard David's words, the battle is the Lord's. And indeed, God can actually do it all by himself if he chooses. He can take care. He doesn't need us at all to take care of Satan and to take care of any evil thing that is out there in the world. Um, but we find examples where God does take care of things all by himself. And one of them is recorded in 2 Kings 19 and other places, where King Sennacherib of Assyria comes down and he laid siege to Jerusalem. And he had this massive army surrounding Jerusalem, and he was going to starve the people out. But what we find happening, and this is recorded in 2 Chronicles chapter 32, verses 20 to 21. It says, now because of this siege that Sennacherib was bringing, King Hezekiah and the prophet Isaiah, the son of Amos, prayed and cried out to heaven. Then the Lord sent an angel who cut down every man of valor, um, leader and captain in the camp of the king of Assyria. So he returned shamefaced to his own land, and when he had gone into the temple of his God, some of his own offspring struck him down with the sword there. And so we find that Sennacherib went home in disgrace, to the point where his own children killed him. They couldn't stand that. We also find in 2 Kings 19, verse 35, describing the same story, where an angel of the Lord came out and killed in the camp of the Assyrians 185,000. So that night, God took care of the army. Done. Nobody, no Hebrew had to do a single thing. God did it. And so we just know that God is absolutely capable of doing everything all by himself. And then there are many other examples in the Old Testament. For example, the Red Sea, when the Hebrews were all at the Red Sea, and Pharaoh's army was coming along, and the swords were drawn and the people were worried, and God told Moses, stretch out your stick and over the sea, and of course it opened. And what we find is that it says that God confused the Egyptian army. And so they all stood there and they were confused, to the point where they decided to take a trip through the Red Sea as well, between the walls of water. And we all know what happened to them. There's another one in 2 Chronicles 20, where three armies came up against Jerusalem to do the same thing that Sennacherib had done. And God just made them all turn on each other. They got into an argument, obviously, and killed each other to the man. And so God does not need help. But there are times when he insists that he does get helped, and he wants us to help him. And that's when victory happens. And so at the end of the day, victory belongs to the saints. When I was a kid in primary school, and I was in standard 3, and I was small, and I'm still small, but let's not talk about that. But I was one of the small guys, and people, there were some kids there who decided they would bully me, and so they were picking on me regularly. There was another guy who was there, and he was in the standard one ahead of me. He was in standard 4, or what you call it, grades now, but anyway. So. And he was a big guy, and nobody, I mean, he was a very big guy. Nobody took him on, but he was a decent guy. And I thought to myself, I need to make him my friend. And he was actually the strongest kid in school. He was that big. And I thought, I got to make him my friend. And so one day I took a bar of chocolate and I just walked up and gave it to him. I said, "Yeah, this is for you." And I turned around and walked away. And the next day, we said hi. He was very happy to see me, kind of thing. And we became good friends after that. And John Bruce was the strongest kid in school, but I was his friend. So that made me the second strongest. And it's important for us to recognize that when we partner with God, we have an immense kind of power, spiritual power. James tells us, resist the devil and he will flee from you. And the way we resist him, of course, is giving our lives to God and being obedient to God. Now, in Deuteronomy, in chapter 7, verses 6 and 7, the God calls the Hebrew people out. And listen to what he says. He says, "For you are a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for his own possession out of all the peoples that are on the face of the earth." So Israel, that group of people who became the nation of Israel, they were chosen. Why? Verse 7, "It was not because you were more in number than any other people that the Lord set his love upon you and chose you, for you were the fewest of all peoples." And it's kind of interesting to me where God, he decided to choose the smallest, weakest nation to become his people. So, and why? Because he could prove that he was in control and that he was God and that he was ultimately powerful. And even today, I know that physical Israel has, according to the Bible, has become spiritual Israel. And we are members of spiritual Israel. And that's where the focus of God is. But even today, when you look at Israel, that small little nation is hanging on against all odds, it seems. If you took a shoebox and put it in the middle of a football field, that's the size of Israel against all of the different Muslim nations around it. And when you start looking at the most people who've won Nobel prizes because of science and math and all those things, the Israelites, the Israeli, are by very, very far the greatest number of people who have gotten them. And so, they were a chosen people, they were a blessed people, and I think that there is still residue from that makes them what they are. But that at the same time, we are spiritual Israel, and that is where God focuses his attention now. And so he chose this least of the nations. Now, he could have done to the Philistines what he did to Sennacherib's army, but he chose a shepherd boy named David. And of course, his stone brought down the giant. God could have taken Noah and he used Noah to go through this huge rigmarole of building this ark and doing what he did, taking him hundreds of years. Um, and God decided, I mean, he could have cleaned the earth out with a flip of his finger, but he decided that this is how he was going to do it. And he was bringing people into his plan. Even Gideon, who started off with 32,000 men, and God made him cull down to 300 men, and they routed the Midianites. And so we see, just as God chose the least of the nations to show who truly has the power, he has a habit of doing that. And so God today requires us to be involved in his plan. And so we read passages like 1 Corinthians chapter 1, 26 through 31, where he says, "For consider your call, brethren, not many of you were wise according to worldly standards, not many were powerful, not many were of noble birth, but God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, even things that are not, to bring to nothing things that are, so that no human being might boast in the presence of God." And so there's another interesting thing. So this is just as he chose Israel, because they were small and insignificant, even although we may be small and insignificant, we are God's people. And because of that, big time. And so we find then as well in 2 Kings chapter 6, another example of a king going against God's people. And so we see where is the king of Syria this time also tries to do the exact same thing that Sennacherib did. And he surrounds Jerusalem and he's trying to lay siege to it. And so Elisha and his servant are standing there, and the servant is very, very concerned about this huge army. And so Elisha prays to God and says, God, open his eyes. And that's what we read here. He says, fear not, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them. Then Elisha prayed and said, O Lord, I pray thee, open his eyes that he may see. So the Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw. And behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire round about Elisha. And so we see then that his servant, and of course Elisha was able to see what was out there. And of course, this huge, divine army of fiery horses with chariots. And so we recognize that while they were given the ability to see, the best we can do is see through the eyes of faith. And we have to, by faith, know that God is on our side, and his angels and his heavenly host are protecting us and doing whatever it is that's necessary. And so we see, like another passage like 1 John 4, verses 3 and 4, where he says, and every spirit which does not confess Jesus is not of God. This is the spirit of Antichrist, of which you heard that it was coming, and now it is in the world already. Little children, you are of God and have overcome them. For he who is in you is greater than he who is in the world. And so all that says is, if he who is above us is within us, we will overcome that which is around us. Now, when he says here that the spirit of Antichrist is in the world already, it was there in the first century when John was writing this, but it never left. It is still here today, the spirit of Antichrist. And when we start looking at the secular world, and all of these crazy things that people believe, like the wokeness, where if a guy identifies as a woman, he can then enter women's sports and beat them up, and just take away anything that a woman could have earned. Some man comes in who just proclaims himself a woman, and he wins, and the crazy world is allowing it. And I believe that's the spirit of Antichrist. In fact, just a few weeks ago, I saw this article about this young girl, and her name is Kaylee Bush, and she was crowned Miss North Florida. And of course, she was in this pageant, and she won this particular title. But what is interesting is that just 2 months later, she was stripped of that title. And the reason is because she refused to sign a contract that allowed trans women to enter the contest. In other words, a man who believed he was a woman, he could enter the contest. Now, a year or 2 years ago, or maybe 18 months ago, there was a guy who entered a pageant like this, and he was ugly. Even as a guy, he was ugly. As a woman, he was even uglier. But he won because nobody wanted to not count him. And this kind of thinking. But what is interesting is that a Christian organization heard about this, and so they stepped up and they honored her and the group that they call themselves is called She Leads America. and it's an organization, and they gave her the Christian Woman of Distinction Award. So she lost that crown, but at the same time, she was recognized by fellow Christians. But people like that are not just recognized by fellow Christians, but they're recognized by God Himself. And so we find that this happens because of the Antichrist that is in there. And that's the battle that we have to fight against. But the story of Elisha and the chariots of fire is not over, because Elisha asked God to strike the Syrians with blindness. And so God did. And this whole army went blind. But then we find an interesting thing happening. Excuse me. God could have destroyed them just like He destroyed Sennacherib. But this is what happens. It says, so he prepared. So what happened was Elisha and the Hebrews went out and led the Syrian army. Oh, excuse me. I better take a sip of water. So, excuse me. It's spring and all the pollen is out there, and I'm struggling. And I've just finished preaching a sermon anyway, so my voice. Anyway, what happened was they led them up to Samaria. And when they got there, instead of killing them, it says He prepared for them a great feast. And when they had eaten and drunk, He sent them away, and they went to their master. And the Syrians came no more on raids into the land of Israel. And this is really, at the end of the day, what illustrates for us the kind of attitude that we as Christians are to do. So what do we do when we engage in the battle? And Jesus has said that in the Gospels. Remember, He said, if a person smites you on the one cheek, turn to him the other. If they force you to carry their baggage 1 mile, carry it 2. That's basically what He's talking about. But I'd like to end this lesson by simply reading Romans 12:14 through 21, because I think that puts in great detail how we ought to behave ourselves when we engage in battle. We're not like the Muslims. We don't pull out the guns and the knives and try to kill people who disagree with us. We do it in a different way. So verses 14 through 21 says, bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse them. Rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep, live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Never be conceited. Repay no one evil for evil, but take thought for what is noble in the sight of all. If possible, so far as it depends upon you, live peaceably with all. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. No, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him drink. For by so doing, you will heap burning coals upon his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. And at the end of the day, that says it for us as Christians. There is this huge war that is out there. And simply because we cannot see it doesn't mean it's not happening. And so we have to constantly be on guard, because we can have, the things that the world teaches, that hedonism and atheism and secularism teaches, that if we're not careful, it begins to make inroads into our minds. And before we know it, we find ourselves stumbling. And so we recognize that God has called us into this battle with Him, but we have to step up and take the armor that He has given to us and use it to do battle and ultimately to win the battle. And that's all I have to share with you today. I'll hit
That,
stop share again, right?
yeah, you eat something. Now, thank you very much, man. Yeah, the time just flew, and it was very interesting. The gods at war, and well, we are thankful that God will never lose a war, but for that sake, we side with Him at the moment, and not just because He's the winner, but because He's the truth. And so, thank you, Des. Very, not entertaining, but filled out with. You kept us glued to the screen. I think that is the best way
Yeah,
to
you're
put
too
it.
kind. Thank you.
Anyway, thanks very much. I felt sorry for you for the frog in the throat.